Hello viewers and welcome to another episode of Elections by Numbers. Today we're talking about the only state with a monosyllabic name, the Pine Tree State, Maine. Originally part of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and during the earliest years of this country, Maine later separated in 1819 to become the 23rd state to join this country. The state is responsible for manufacturing about 90% of the toothpicks in the United States. The state is also the setting for a pretty high number of modern horror fiction masterpieces written by one of my favorite authors, Stephen King. King is a resident of Bangor, Maine, and sets many of his stories like It, Salem's Lot, The Institute, in fictional towns called Derry or Castle Rock, which are loosely based on Bangor, as I understand. Maine also has 2 congressional House districts, and both of them are currently represented by Democrats. I consider only one of Maine's districts to be competitive this year, and that is Maine's 2nd district, which covers about 80% of the land area in the state, and flipped as recently as 2018 when Jared Golden, a current Democratic representative, won the district by a just over 1% margin of the vote. Today, the district is rated as having a Cook Political Reports Partisan Voting Index score of +2 into the Republican column when compared to the national average, which is a pretty relatively centrist leaning considering how far off it could be. Golden is running for a 2nd term this November against a Republican challenger named Dale Crafts. To understand more about how Mainers vote, let's pull up 2 double line graphs. We're going to put them right side by side. So first, focusing on this line graph, on the left side of your screen, you'll see Democrats statewide, this is for the entire state of Maine, holding a relatively consistent edge over Republicans over the last 10 years. In 2016, we saw them come really close. Of course, that's the year that Donald Trump won his first term over Hillary Clinton. And if you'll compare that graph to the one on the right, you'll also see that 2016 was, along with 2014, those were 2 years where Republicans in Maine's 2nd district outvoted Democrats. Therefore, we saw a 2-term Republican congressman winning in 2014 and then again in 2016, but then losing his 3rd term to Jared Golden in 2018 when Democrats came out back on top. When we're looking at the state as a whole, though, we've seen so many states in the past in this series so far where Democrats just run away with turnout going from 2016 to 2018. That's just not the case, though, in Maine for whatever reason. I mean, Maine Democrats performed slightly better in 2018 than they did in 2014, but that's really not saying much. I mean, you could say the same thing for Republicans almost. They pretty much maintained the same distance in their voter turnout those years. But the very, very slight improvement on Democrats' end in the 2nd district was enough for them to flip the district 2 years ago. So let's toss those aside. We then have to ask ourselves, okay, is the trajectory of turnout for Democrats and Republicans, how is that going to play out this November? Is Jared Golden, could he win a 2nd term? Is he going to be defeated? And I do think because we're just talking about the 2nd district and we're looking at that line graph that was on the right side, we saw Republicans with a better slope value actually surpassing the expected turnout for Democrats going into 2020. And for that reason, I don't think Jared Golden is going to be able to win a 2nd term this November. Democrats in Maine just did not enjoy the turnout surge that a lot of other states did in 2018. And as we'll learn later, Maine's 2nd district was one that voted for Trump by about a 10% margin, but we'll get into that in a later section. If this district does flip like I'm anticipating, I think it'll be by the narrowest of margins. I'm talking like maybe less than 1,000 votes. This is a bold call on my end. This is really a pure toss-up, but I'm doing this whole series with no toss-up, so I'm making the call right now. Maine's 2nd flipping back to Republican after 2 years of Democratic representation. Let's put it on our first map. Mark it. Up next, we have a very high-stakes Senate race in the state of Maine. Incumbent Republican Senator Susan Collins is running for a 5th term against a Democratic challenger named Sara Gideon, who is the current Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives. This race is one of a small handful of races at the Senate level that Democrats really have their eye on as being the most vulnerable in terms of flipping over to their sides. Therefore, they're targeting it heavily this November. And the reason for that perceived vulnerability by Democrats is because of the incumbent, Susan Collins, who over the past 2 years has really eroded her reputation as a more moderate Republican among Senate Republicans. And that really began almost 2 years ago in October 2018 when Susan Collins voted to approve now Justice Brett Kavanaugh to be the next member of the Supreme Court, which angered a lot lot of Democrats and moderates, and sort of rocked their perception of her as being one of the more moderate of Republicans. Soon after that vote, a fund was set up actually, which is now up in the multi-million-dollar amounts that would be given to whoever Collins' eventual opponent would be this November. Of course, that turned out to be Sara Gideon, so she's got I think it's about $4 million war chest already at her disposal. And if Collins' vote on Kavanaugh wasn't enough, she would go on later to vote to acquit Donald Trump on both charges that for which he was impeached by the U.S. House, leaving Senator Mitt Romney of Utah to be the only Republican in the Senate to vote to convict. And as a result of both of these votes, Susan Collins has quickly gone from being one of the most popular senators in the Senate to one of the least approved senators in the Senate. I mean, we're talking like a 30-point plus drop in approval rating. She went from Bernie Sanders levels down to Mitch McConnell levels, if you know what I'm saying. As of this video, she's at about a negative 15 net approval rating. I think about 37% of Mainers approve versus 52% that disapprove. But there's another layer to this story, actually. Why there's so much Democratic doubt about flipping the seat in the first place is because the last time Susan Collins ran, so when she ran for her fourth term in 2014, she won that race by about 37% margin of the vote, which is mind-blowing. Of course, that was before all this drama about voting Brett Kavanaugh into the Supreme Court. This was before the very thought of Donald Trump as a president had entered anyone's minds. So a lot has changed in 6 years, but Democrats are having trouble shaking that perception that she's untouchable. So I hope you've been able to retain at least some of what I've told you in the last minute. Let's take a look at some voter turnout ratios to see how Mainers vote for senators. Okay, and here we're looking at some numbers that are, yes, very, very revealing. And, for the sake of consistency with my other videos, I've even lumped in Maine's other senator, Angus King, into the Democratic column here, even though he's technically registered as an independent, because he always caucuses with Democrats when it comes time to vote. Therefore, the Democrats' turnout voter ratios that you see in 2012 and 2018 belong to independent Senator Angus King. What I'm more interested in these numbers, though, is that 2014 value. Of course, you will see that Susan Collins' voter turnout ratio is about 3 times that of her Democratic challenger from 6 years ago, which is the reason why she was able to defeat her opponent by about 37% margin of the vote that year. Of course, Maine Democrats as a whole throughout the entire state outvoted Republicans at the House level, but that 181 some percent value that Susan Collins enjoyed in 2014 was more than enough to make up for that deficit in raw voter turnout at the House level, propelling her to a 4th term. Of course, it was probably helped a lot that she used to have a good approval rating back in those days. What these numbers tell me is that Mainers are not particularly loyal to either party. They're more about the candidate. They care about the candidates that they're voting for more than the party that they belong to. It's the reason why every other election cycle, going back over the last decade anyway, the party with the advantage has switched up. Ultimately, I wouldn't put too much weight into these values, so let's toss them aside. I've already told you Susan Collins' approval rating as of this video, it's minus 15, which is a more than 30-point drop over just the last 2 years. So now it's finally time to turn to Pollbot to calculate. We're taking in 3 variables for this equation: raw voter turnout at the House, those voter turnout ratios, and the approval rating of the incumbent Susan Collins. Pollbot, let's take all that together and see who is going to win in November, Susan Collins or Sara Gideon. Aha, and there we have our result, and this is a big deal. Sara Gideon, the Democratic challenger to Susan Collins, is going to win the state of Maine by about 7.26% margin of victory. This is the first flip we've seen so far in this series in favor for Democrats. We saw just a couple weeks ago Democrats losing a seat in the state of Alabama. So now with Susan Collins going down largely in part because of her very, very low approval rating at this point, we're back to a net gain of 0 in the Senate. The rise and fall of Susan Collins is one that's likely to be studied by political scientists for many decades to come. So let's make this official and put it on our senatorial map. Mark it. Now it is time to talk about the presidential election of 2020, starring President Donald Trump and Democratic challenger Joe Biden. The state of Maine, along with Nebraska, is a state that awards its electoral college votes, of which it has 4, a little differently from every other state. So because there are 2 2 congressional House districts, there are 4 electoral college votes. An electoral college vote is awarded for the popular vote winner of each district, plus an additional 2 for the popular vote winner of the state as a whole. Therefore, depending on how the candidates perform in Maine's first and in Maine's second, and in those 2 combined, the state can award electoral college votes any number of ways. 4 years ago, we saw Donald Trump win Maine's second district, but Hillary Clinton win Maine's first district, and the state as a whole, the popular vote of the state as a whole. And so that ended with Hillary Clinton receiving 3 electoral college votes to Donald Trump's 1 from the state of Maine. Little side trivia, that splitting of the vote by district is the first time that's happened in almost 200 years, since I believe the last president to receive part of the vote from Maine was Andrew Jackson. So now I'm going to pull up 2 different charts for you. I'm going to bring up more voter turnout ratios for presidents, but I'm going to do them for the state as a whole, and I'm going to have a separate chart for Maine's second district, which is the more competitive of the 2. Let's bring those up right now. Okay, so first we're going to look at the presidential House voter ratios for Maine at large. That's the chart that you see on top there. What we're seeing over the last decade is an advantage that was more significant for Republicans in 2012 than it was 4 years ago in 2016. Donald Trump received only 94% of the votes that both Republican House candidates received running in the state that year, but that was still slightly more than Hillary Clinton received in terms of ratio. She only received just about 92.5% of the votes that both Democratic candidates received running in the House that year. With vote ratios that close to each other, that's ultimately not much of a difference maker, though. I mean, remember, this is relative to House turnout, and Maine at large has seen Democrats holding a pretty consistent edge over the last 10 years. So this is the reason why Hillary Clinton was able to carry the state as a whole while still losing the popular vote in Maine's second district. And yes, that second district is another story. I mean, let's now look at the chart on the bottom. Again, we see better numbers for Republicans than Democrats, and these numbers, these values are relative to raw House turnout just within the second district. So this is excluding Maine's first district, which includes Portland and Augusta, the state capital, the more populous regions of the state. So because Donald Trump, his voter turnout ratio was it was just about 5% higher than Hillary Clinton's was in 2016, and congressional Republican candidates received a relatively higher number of votes that year than they had in other years this past decade. Trump was able to carry Maine's second district by, I believe, about a 10% margin of the vote. So one wonders then, okay, will he still be able to maintain that enthusiasm going into November? Well, let's toss those charts aside. Lastly, we have to consider Trump's approval rating in the state. And unfortunately, I cannot break that down by district because I couldn't find enough data for it. But in Maine as a whole, as of this video, Trump is at negative 28 points. He's got a 34% approval rating versus a 62% disapproval rating in the state at large. And we're gonna have to just apply that figure to both Maine at large and Maine second district for the sake of these calculations. So I believe we have everything we need. We're gonna do 2 calculations. First, we're gonna do Maine at large, the state as a whole, and we're already assuming Maine's first district is going to go Democrat because it's a much further left-leaning district. So Pollbot, let's take all those figures for Maine at large and calculate how this is gonna go down. Okay, and there we have our first result, and it says Joe Biden is going to win Maine's first district and the state at large for a total of 3 electoral college votes by about 7.34% margin of the vote. This is actually an improvement on Hillary Clinton from 4 years ago. She carried Maine at large by, I believe, just about 3% margin of the vote. So this is a good step for Democrats. Secondly, we're going to do Maine's second district, which is the much more competitive of the 2 districts in the state. Pollbot, can you help us out there too? Aha. Okay, very interesting. And actually, we're seeing Trump improving on his performance from 4 years ago in Maine's second by one percentage point. He beat Hillary Clinton by about 10% 4 years ago, and now we're having him at 11.66% margin of victory in Maine's second district, meaning that he will receive 1 electoral college vote from the state versus Joe Biden's 3. The reason Trump's probably going to be able to carry Maine's second, according to my calculations, is because of my perceived great turnout for Republicans at the House level within Maine's second, and the fact that he won the district pretty handily 4 years ago. In the end, this is the same result from 4 years ago, actually, with Hillary Clinton winning 3 and Donald Trump winning 1, except in this case we got Joe Biden on the ticket. So let's make that official and put it on our presidential map. Mark it. So now we have all the election results in for the state of Maine, and I think it's been a pretty exciting one myself. We've seen a lot of action in such a relatively small state with a flip in the House and a flip in the Senate. Now let's take a little time to talk briefly about the future of the Pine Tree State by, just looking at a bunch of graphs. So let's first look at the raw House turnout for the state as a whole over the last 10 years. This is the first graph that I showed you in the video. Let's look specifically at the slope values for both of those equations that you can see. That is, those values represent the number of additional votes that candidates from a given party receive relative to the votes that they received 2 years prior. So every 2 years, on average, Democrats have received 1,500 more votes than they did in the previous 2 years, but Republicans are skunking them on that front with nearly 10,000, so 9,500 additional votes every 2 years, making up for their deficit in voter turnout that we saw earlier in the decade. This major advantage in the slope value that we see on Republicans' end is largely why I've projected that Maine's 2nd district is more likely than not going to flip this November. And to back up that claim, let's also bring up a second double line graph here. This is the raw turnout for just Maine's 2nd district over the last 10 years. So because Republicans outperformed Democrats in 2014 and then again in 2016, that means that Maine's 2nd district was represented by a Republican for 2 terms, for 4 years. And then when current representative of Maine's 2nd, Jared Golden, won in 2018, it was by about a 1% margin of victory, which is why it's almost imperceptible, the difference in turnout values for both parties. But again, let's look at the slope values for both of those equations. So Republicans have a slope value of 9.3 in this case, but Democrats have a negative slope value, minus 4.2. So over the last 10 years, when you look at that as a whole, on average, every 2 years, Democratic representation has decreased by 4,200 votes, meaning that the net gain every 2 years for Republicans is about 13,500 votes, if I did my math correctly in my head. So this backs up my claim, I believe, that Maine's 2nd is going to flip back to Republican this November, but that remains to be seen, of course. And lastly, let's look at 2 double line graphs at once here. So on the left, we're seeing the estimated rate of increase or decrease for voter turnout ratios for senatorial candidates. And you'll see that, I think largely because of Susan Collins' incredible performance in 2014, we see Republicans having a consistent edge on voter enthusiasm, those voter turnout ratios, going back over the last 10 years, last 3 senatorial election cycles. And both parties are basically increasing those values at pretty similar rates. But I don't know how reliable these ratios are going to be going into this November because Susan Collins' approval rating has plummeted so dramatically. And then next, if we look at the presidential to House voter ratio estimates of increase or decrease, we see enthusiasm sort of dropping off really for Republicans. And this is largely due to the fact that Mitt Romney had better voter turnout ratios in 2012 than Donald Trump had in 2016, which is peculiar because Donald Trump actually won a district in 2016 where Mitt Romney won neither. And we can account for that by the fact that Republicans generally performed relatively better in 2016 than they had in the past at the House level, and Democrats just weren't able to keep up in Maine's 2nd district that year. The fact that Republicans' estimated rate of decrease is more significant than that of Democrats is also largely why I think Joe Biden will perform slightly better this November than Hillary Clinton did 4 years ago. Okay, let's toss all that aside. I'll give you my final consensus on Maine. I mentioned it earlier, but I believe I perceive Maine as a state that is more loyal to the candidate than they are to the party that they belong to, just as a rule. I mean, as of now, they have a Republican senator and an independent senator who caucuses with Democrats. And just 4 years ago, we saw both of their congressional House districts split their votes. However, if I'm forced to just look at party identity within the state of Maine itself, I do think we're likely to see a state that is becoming slightly more Republican. Yes, I've projected that Donald Trump is not going to carry the state at large this November, nor did I predict that Susan Collins would be able to win again. But because of the trajectory of just raw House turnout, I think in a post-Trump, post-Susan Collins world, I would not be surprised to see a much more competitive Maine in more upcoming national elections. You know, I've been led to believe before that New Hampshire is the most competitive district, or rather the most competitive state in New England, but from what I see, it's looking more like Maine's going to fill that role in the years to come. And that just about does it for our latest episode of Elections by Numbers. I want to thank you, the viewer, for tuning in today. If you like what you saw, please hit the subscribe button to get updates on new content as it becomes available. I upload videos every Monday and Thursday. I'm also on Twitter, and I update that account with which state I'm covering next ahead of the scheduled release date. So if you want to stay ahead of the curve, please give me a follow on Twitter, and that link is in the description. Thanks again for watching. Thank you for voting. See you next time.